With his focus still squarely on Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has developed a sort of tunnel vision. He's so obsessed with winning the war that he started that he's losing sight of serious problems at home. Tensions are bubbling under the surface, and once the Ukraine war is over, they threaten to explode. Something big is breaking in Russia. Putin can't hide it anymore. He may not even be fully aware of it. But if Russia does come up with a solution soon, it may not be Ukraine that presents the biggest threat to the country. It could end up being Russia's own people. The big problem that is breaking in Russia right now is simple. The country doesn't have anywhere near enough police. That's according to the Kyiv Post's Chuck Farrar, who published an opinion piece on November 10th that takes a detailed look at Russia's policing situation and the many problems it now faces. Farrar dubs the situation a time bomb ticking away and that it's a major problem for Putin. Why? Well, the Russian leader has maintained power for so long, in part because he operates a police state. With enough officers in place, Putin can control the minds of the majority of the Russian people because they know that a spell in the gulag awaits anybody who angers their leader. With no police comes a reduced threat. And that could be enough to cause Russia to eat itself in waves of crime, violence, and protest. Farrar sums up the issue that Russia faces with an interesting statistic. With 1 in 3 police positions unfilled nationwide since the full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the country's internal security is under strain. This shortage has led to rising crime rates, increased violence, and a potential shift in how the Kremlin maintains order at home. We'll cover some of the consequences that Farrar raises later in the video. Right now, it's important to note that Farrar isn't the only person who has raised the question of just what on earth is going on with Russia's policing situation. On October 30th, the Jamestown Foundation published a piece that covers much the same ground as Farrar's. It points out that Russia's police crisis is a strange situation to consider. Right now, the country has about 2.5 times the number of police officers per capita as the US, along with nearly 2 times as many officers per capita as the European Union. So there are a lot of police in Russia. The issue arises not in the numbers alone, but in the fact that Russia is a police state. The country needs far more police than the other nations and entities cited because the Kremlin tries to exercise more control over its people. Police are the mechanism to do that. A shortage means control starts slipping. How bad is the situation? Well, the Jamestown Foundation says that Russia's police shortage is bad enough that there are many stations across the country that are either partially or fully empty. The result here is that the few police officers who remain in these stations are having to work much longer hours than they should, which adds an element of burnout to the situation that creates even more strain. Other resources highlight that Russia's police shortage isn't exactly breaking news. All the way back in October 2023, Interfax published a report in which it stated that the Russian Interior Ministry claims to lack 100,000 police officers. The then head of the ministry's financial and economic department, Irina Kalflish, had plenty to say about the issue at the time. The level of allowances, salaries in our institution, to put it mildly, is not just uncompetitive, it's already hard to even talk about it. And we currently have a shortage of 100,000 employees out of the total of 700,000. And these are mostly combat units, Kalflish declared in 2023 before adding, "The issue of having a policeman on the street is very acute and urgent." You might think that Putin would have taken all of this into account a couple of years ago, as he has to know that the control he exercises is heavily reliant on a massive police force that works in the service of the Kremlin. But fast forward 2 years and Russia's police shortage hasn't gotten any better. In fact, it's gotten worse. Much worse. Russia has solved its acute and urgent police problem by doing approximately nothing in the 2 years since the problem was announced. According to Farrar, Russia's Interior Minister Vladimir Kolokotsev now claims that the country's Ministry of Internal Affairs lacks 172,000 of the personnel that it needs to staff its police force. That's 18.3% of the total Russian force gone, and it gets even worse than that. The Russian Federal Penitentiary Service faces an even larger deficit, at least when it comes to percentages, as it's lacking 23% of the officers it needs. That particular service may not be as much of a problem for Putin. After all, he has been pulling criminals out of prison to fight and die on the Ukraine war front lines. He could claim that Russia doesn't need as many prison officers because it no longer has as many prisoners. In fact, November 10th brought with it the news that the Russian Ministry of Defense is offering amnesty to an even wider array of criminals than it already was, as long as those criminals are willing to go to war. United 24 Media says that convicted serial killers and violent offenders now have the ability to exchange their lengthy sentences for participation in combat operations. When they come back, they will enjoy an early release from prison. That will probably end up being the spark that lights the police powder keg that's already forming in Russia. but we'll get to that in a few minutes. Even if Putin could excuse the shortfall in penitentiary officers, he can't do the same for Russia's wider police force. It's severely lacking in the personnel it needs to ensure that Putin keeps control over Russia. Russia's police state is unraveling before Putin's eyes. And you have to wonder how Russia's leader allowed all of this to happen. There are a few factors at play here. Low pay is among them, and that's been a problem ever since Kalbfleisch highlighted the issue that the Kremlin's done nothing to solve. In September 2023, the BBC's Russian service published a piece in which it claimed that Russia's police force was burned out, disappointed, and confused. One former police officer based in Russia's Rostov region highlighted the pay problem as it stood in 2023. "Back then I was getting 50,000 rubles, not bad," the officer claimed, when speaking about his hiring amidst former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev's 2011 police reforms. But 50,000 now, after inflation and the new prices, they haven't adjusted the salary at all. For context, 50,000 rubles per month amounts to about $615, which is hardly an earth-shattering figure, even in Russia. That's 12 years of salary stagnation in effect. The BBC says the situation was bad enough 2 years ago that many Russian police officers were choosing to leave the force to work in less demanding roles that paid more. The officer who made the 50,000 rubles claims now works as a taxi driver, the outlet says. One of that officer's friends works as a courier, and both earn twice as much in those roles as they did when serving as police officers. If anything, the average wage for Russian police in 2023 was even lower than it was when the officer to whom the BBC spoke started. The outlet said that the average was hovering around the 40,000 rubles mark in September 2023, which was 23,000 rubles less than the average Russian salary. You can probably guess what we're about to say. Just like how the Kremlin ignored the police shortage when it was flagged up in 2023, it also appears to have ignored any complaints about officer pay. Farrar highlights this in his Kyiv Post piece, as he says that average pay in 2025 is actually worse than it was in 2023. Now a patrol officer can expect to pick up about 38,000 rubles, or around $380 per month, which is less than a basic cashier job in Moscow pays. And to make matters worse for Russia's police officers, they can't even rely on the bribes and the shakedowns they previously used to supplement their meager wages. Russia has cracked down on corruption in its police force, so the benefits package of sorts that Russia's officers used to enjoy has disappeared. So with a career in Russia's police force being a non-starter, where are the many officers, both experienced and prospective, turning instead? You guessed it, the Russian military. If there's one job in Russia that is paying amazingly right now, it's the job of sacrificing yourself to Putin's Ukraine war tunnel vision. Signing bonuses for the Russian military alone amount to around 200,000 rubles in some Russian regions, which is almost twice the salary that the average police officer takes home. Add to that an annual salary of about the same amount for a new recruit, and the choice is a no-brainer. If somebody is skilled with weapons or is willing to learn, then the Russian military represents a far faster path to a good wage than the police force ever did in Russia. How can the Russian police force compete with that? Another factor here is that the people who are being tempted into a career in Russia's military are also the target audience for the vacant positions in Russia. Data on the ratio of women to men in the Russian police force is hard to come by. However, a graph published by Helgi Library shows that the ratio was 16.5% women to 83.5% men in 2015, and that was a decline from the previous year's figures. The men who might otherwise be serving as police in Russia are instead fighting in Ukraine. If the shortages that were massive in 2023 and have only grown since are anything to go by, Russia hasn't been replacing those men with female officers. What Putin has on his hands here is a recipe for disaster, and it's a recipe that's already coming to boil and will soon simmer over. Crime is already on the rise in Russia, Farrar points out. With fewer officers available, response times to incidents have lengthened and preventative policing has declined, Farrar writes. As a result, crime rates in Russia are climbing sharply and the nature of offences is growing more violent. Offences involving illegal firearms, estimated at 25,000 in 2020, have surged due to smuggling from Ukraine and diversions from military stockpiles. Urban areas and Russia's many remote regions in the south and east of the country are the worst affected, Farrar adds. Violent crime, including homicide, armed robbery and assault, is all on the rise, as Russia's police force is stretched thin. Russia is also having to deal with the issue of returning veterans coming home and committing violent crimes. According to a June piece published by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, veterans have killed or seriously injured around 500 Russian civilians already, and that number is only going to get worse as more of Russia's war-weary and combat-hardened soldiers come home. Exposed to the brutality of the Ukraine war, those soldiers have spent however long they've served learning that violence is the answer to all of their problems. They'll be coming back to Russia with more money than they know what to do with and massive chips on their shoulders. Russian civilians are already starting to pay the price. In November 2024, the BBC shared the opinion of sociologist Igor Eidman. When asked what's happening when Russia's veterans come back home, he painted a dreadful picture for the rest of Russian society. This is a very serious problem, and it can potentially get worse. All the traditional ideas of good and evil are being turned upside down. The BBC also reports on comments made by a Russian police officer named Grigory, who spoke to Novaya Gazeta. He speaks of encountering a criminal he'd helped to lock up, who had been released, fought in Ukraine, and came back home a free man. 4 years ago, I put him away for 7 years, Grigory said. And here he is in front of me again saying, "You won't be able to do anything, officer. Now's our time, the time of those who are shedding blood in the special military operation." Add that to the list of reasons why Russia has a police shortage. What right-minded Russian would want to serve in a police force that can be pushed around by the new elites of Russian society? Soldiers are now much higher on the totem pole, and they know it. Along with the pay disparity, the increased social status could be enough to convince many would-be police officers who instead choose to serve in the Russian military. Now think about this. The veteran-related rise in crime inside Russia is just a hint of what's to come for the nation's understaffed police force. As Farrar notes in his Kyiv Post piece, 500,000 soldiers have already rotated back to Russia since Putin launched his invasion, and many hundreds of thousands more will be coming back home once the Ukraine war ends. Let's imagine that the war magically ends tomorrow. A slow rotation won't happen. There will be a huge influx of war-hardened soldiers flooding back into Russia, many of them with the same attitudes as those soldiers who have already returned home. Frustration is mounting. Reports of domestic violence, public altercations, and criminal activity involving ex-soldiers are increasing sharply. These men bring not only skills but also weapons, often illegally retained, into communities already short on oversight, Farrar writes. This is already a flood of criminality returning to Russia, and that flood will become a tidal wave once the Ukraine war ends. And that's just the regular soldiers. We've touched on Putin's willingness to introduce the criminal element into his military, which means a large percentage of the soldiers that will eventually come home are people who should have been locked up. And it's hardly like Russia has been picky when it comes to which of its criminals it sends to Ukraine. Back in October 2024, the Moscow Times said that Russia was taking a quantity over quality approach when it comes to its convicted soldiers. All Putin cares about is having the manpower advantage in Ukraine. It doesn't matter how bad the criminals he sends over are, as evidenced by Russia now sending serial killers and other violent offenders into the meat grinder. Any who survive are going to come back home, and they'll return having seen more brutality than ever before, and will also have the skills they need to aid their own future criminality. The numbers are shocking. Back in January, the Kyiv Independent reported that Russia has recruited up to 180,000 convicts for the war in Ukraine, many of whom were sent to the Wagner mercenary group. As of 2024, Russia has between 300,000 and 350,000 more potential soldiers to pull from its prisons, the outlet says. Putin has created a terrible cycle here. The longer the war goes on, the more thousands of convicts he will send into Ukraine. Many of those convicts will die, but more being sent also means more coming back home. If Russia thinks it has a crime problem right now, just wait until that flood of criminals comes back home. An already overstretched police force will stand no chance against the thousands of people it had once locked up, who are starting to turn to organized crime and violence to ensure they're receiving the same level of income as they received when they were soldiers. Putin knows how much of a danger these returning criminals will pose to Russian society. That's according to Australia's ABC News, which claims that several sources inside the Kremlin state that Putin is trying to prepare for the return of the convict army that he created. In October, the outlet said that as many as 700,000 Russians are fighting in Ukraine, and that up to 180,000 of them are convicts. If Putin is concerned about that ratio, he isn't showing it. During a Kremlin meeting in June, he reportedly expressed his deep belief in his convict army plan before adding, "The people who made the conscious decision to serve the motherland and thereby achieve personal success should gradually occupy certain positions." Oh, problem solved then. Russia's convicts will come back and happily accept far lower pay for work in other roles. It makes sense. After all, these are the people who've proven that they can operate lawfully in Russian society before. Sarcasm aside, it seems that Putin has a very short-sighted view of the potential consequences of his decision, even if what he is saying publicly doesn't reflect how he feels privately. With Russia's police force in such dire straits, the convict army will also be coming home to a country that is far less able to control it. There's another factor that might come into play too: alcohol. The old stereotype makes light of Russians being fond of their vodka, but alcoholism has started to become a problem in Russia since Putin launched the invasion. In January 2024, the Moscow Times reported that alcohol dependency in Russia had risen for the first time in almost a decade. The COVID pandemic had already started to reverse a trend of consistent decline in alcoholism cases, and the misery and brutality of the Ukraine war seemed to have turned things around entirely. Russia doesn't seem to publish figures covering the number of crimes committed in the country that have some relation to alcohol consumption. However, we get an idea from other countries. Alcohol Change offers figures for the UK, for example. It says that alcohol is a factor in 39% of all violent crimes committed in England, with that number rising to 49% for Wales. Of course, being drunk doesn't automatically lead to violence, but in a society that's already seeing the return of rotated soldiers and will eventually have a flood of hundreds of thousands return home, many of whom are convicts, alcohol could become a combustible element to add to the equation. Russia is going to need far more police officers than it has right now to deal with these problems. A shortage of 172,000 personnel isn't a good starting point. As for solutions to Russia's growing police shortage, Putin doesn't seem to have many. You could take his vague June mentions of returning soldiers gradually occupying other positions as a hint that he might think that Russia's veterans could end up becoming police officers. However, Russia's leader doesn't seem to have created any programs that could aid in this happening. The best Putin has managed is the signing of a decree in December 2022 that was meant to increase the number of police officers in Russia to 938,000 by 2025. That number hasn't been hit. And returning soldiers are very unlikely to accept the massive drop-off in pay they'll get for becoming police officers once the war ends. Russia is already struggling to recruit police because even the country's most basic jobs seem to pay more than being a police officer does. Putin's other option might be to quell any organized violence that results from the return of Russian veterans, much like the shutdown of the Wagner rebellion in 2023 for says. But that would mean Putin turning Russia's domestic security apparatus against its own people in a way that goes beyond the typical police state that Putin oversaw before he launched his invasion. Barar puts it simply, as Ukraine holds firm on the battlefield, the cost of Putin's imperial ambitions are reverberating homeward, he writes. Without reforms, higher pay incentives to retain officers, or a drawdown in Ukraine, the hollowing out of Russia's police will continue. A hollow Russian police force isn't ready for the storm that's brewing on the horizon. Neither is Putin. His control over Russia may hang in the balance, and it's all his own fault. Speaking about control, Putin is losing it in Crimea as well. A Ukrainian firestorm has devoured the Crimean Peninsula, and Putin was as powerless to stop it as he is to handle Russia's police crisis. Ukraine's asymmetric assault is paying dividends, and you can find out how if you check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe for more coverage of Russia's deteriorating domestic state. And thank you as always for watching.